Right off the bat, I just want to recognize that I know there's a lot of background noise. That's just because I'm on yet another road trip. And if you've heard any of my recent episodes, you've heard me make this same excuse that rarely do I have the time between work and outside of work life to sit down and dedicate any significant amount of time to my own endeavors. So I take the time where I can, when I can get it, no matter how it affects the quality of my output. I'm trying to own that these days instead of comparing myself to people that create content for a living. This is me, this is what I do, this is how I do it. And if you're willing to stick around and take this ride with me, literally and figuratively, can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Hey, how's it? I'm Dan. Welcome back to Breathing Underwater's Moviecast. This is going to be a relatively shorter one than my usual ramblings because I don't have any big hot takes or nitpicks or analyses to do here. This is just more of a theme that I want to draw attention to for what it's worth. Something that I wasn't expecting when I first started digging into this stuff, but a theme, a motif that presented itself that I couldn't help but notice as I watched more and more of these movies and then reflected on them. And what that theme is optimism. So I was born in the 80s, but I was really a child of the 90s because, in the 80s I was really young and I remember some stuff, but I really wasn't influenced as much by 80s pop culture and media as I was in the 90s when I was a lot more independent about what I was seeking out and I was, developing a younger identity at the time and all that kind of stuff. But then I came of age, as it were, in 2001 when 9/11 happened and I was living in New York. And if you're curious to hear more about my experiences with that and some other global disasters and issues that I was present for, I did a podcast on my Adventurecast podcast called Being There During 9/11 and Maui's Tsunamis. But the reason that I bring that up here is just to say that I don't think it's a big secret or a hot take or anything to suggest that our post 9/11 world, when it comes to media and fiction and art output, has had a lot more cynicism and nihilism than it did previously, which, obviously just makes sense. So many things were happening or coming to a head in the 2000s and moving forward in our Y2K new century that us millennials, I guess I'm an elder millennial, so I was from the early 80s, that we lived through and grew up through that weren't present when we were younger. And a lot of that was like global unrest and economic unrest and inconsistency. The 90s especially were generally a time of, at least for middle class Americans like me, were, pretty surplusful and comfortable. People still had to struggle. My parents had to work very hard to keep the family afloat, but they didn't have huge amounts of debt and they were educated and, they were able to pivot when challenges presented themselves. So I think a lot of the media that was being created, a lot of the art, film and stories that were being put out during that time had a bit more of an optimistic lightheartedness to them. Things weren't as biting and critical, and I'm just talking generally here. Of course, there's always been really harsh satire, there's always been really dark comedy, there's been really messed up horror and everything in between, of course. But just looking at it now, 20 years plus removed from that era that I was so familiar with and so much a part of the consumerism at the time, it's hard not to notice how much things changed after 9/11. But it wasn't just 9/11, it was also the fact that, internet was going from dial-up and its early, web 1.0 or 1.5 days to the 2.0 and beyond days with broadband and wireless, faster speeds, more connections, social media, wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, constant threat of, terrorism domestically, so much more unrest that fed into economic issues and housing bubbles bursting. And it would just seem like one thing after another after a time, at least a decade that I can remember or more, of relative calm and not big ripples in the Western world waters, as it were. Ooh, that was a great alliteration that I didn't plan on. Let's see if I can pull any more out. Anyway, now one thing that I always enjoyed, because I am a hopeless, helpless romantic, was comedy and romance and rom-coms, especially, you know, teenage stuff during like the late 90s and 2000s. I was totally the target demographic for like American Pie and, you know, any Julia Stiles vehicle. Loved all that kind of stuff, you know, especially as I became a teenager and a young adult, and I was of that dating age and could really relate to all that stuff, and there was a lot to learn, you know, about the mating game. But revisiting a lot of that stuff, looking back on it now, after all the time that's gone by and all the stuff that's been released in between, it's hard not to notice a marked change of tone and attitude and like thematic content, where things used to be much more lighthearted and lower stakes. You know, it's like, is he going to make it to prom, or are they going to stay together, you know, until they go off to college or something? And things would usually work out, or they'd work out for the best, or there'd be a reconciliation. Whereas since that time, and again, not to say that that's never been darker stuff or more ambiguous or nihilistic things during that time, but post 9/11, it just feels like comedy had got so cynical and mean-spirited, and there was just so much bickering and like almost sociopathic character traits and characterizations. Protagonists and main characters became more and more, at least for me, like harder to relate to and really get behind, because they were just really selfish and self-absorbed, but not in like redeemable ways, but in like cruel ways. And they would do things to people. You know, rom-coms seem to get harder and harder to justify, like these people getting together and how cruel and hurtful they could be to each other. And I just kind of fell out of love with a lot of that stuff. I stopped watching a lot of those things. But that's not really what I want to discuss here, is my disillusionment of comedy and rom-com and romance and things that used to be more palatable genres prior to the turn of the century. I'm just trying to set the stage for the context of why I found revisiting or visiting for the first time things from the 90s and early 2000s that I hadn't seen before, and how refreshing they were. Because I'm sure I would have enjoyed them back then, but watching them now was even more stark contrast to the past 20-25 years, because it turns out that my wife is also a big fan of a lot of 90s comedies and dramedies and rom-coms, but she stuck with a lot of that stuff and went a lot deeper into it than I did. Like I said, I was a lot more involved in the teen side of things until I grew out of it, but I didn't pay as much attention to the adult skewing kind of stuff, or there were certain things that I had expectations for right off the bat, you know, having seen it marketed back in the 90s and being like, oh, that's just not for me, and I'm not gonna go out of my way to see it unless it's on a date or something. So there were a lot of things in the 90s that I missed, and, you know, just organically these things coming up here and there since I've been watching stuff with my wife, looking for things to watch and things, you know, popping up on streaming, where she would say like, oh, have you ever seen this, or isn't this such a great movie? And I'd be like, oh, I actually never saw that. And then she's like, oh, we gotta watch that. And then I did, and the theme that really popped up, the motif that I was referring to earlier, was, wow, that was like really, really good and really refreshingly positive and made me happy. And, you know, what more of like that can we watch? So I started writing them down, as we would over the past few years, you know, just kind of randomly like catch up and watch some of this stuff, not planning on it necessarily, not going everywhere looking for it, but just, you know, it coming up. There's a few movies I like to highlight, even though there's probably more that I could add to this list that aren't really noteworthy. But here's just a quick overview of some movies that I had never seen, that I had heard about for one reason or another, but just never saw, and then saw with my wife and absolutely adored. First up, the one that kind of kicked off this whole thing early on is Legally Blonde. And this one I totally remember when it came out. And I liked Reese Witherspoon. I actually first saw her in one of my favorite never talked about Disney live action movies A Far Off Place when she was a teen. And the reason that I love that movie so much, not just because it was a great movie and well done and had great like practical effects and really, really good tension for, you know, in a family friendly, but the way that Disney used to do it, where family friendly still meant, you know, they were pushing the boundaries a little bit and things were edgy and a little bit violent, and, you know, it wasn't all just like G-rated schlock. But before we saw that one, I remember seeing the theater a few times, because my parents were those kind of people that if they liked something and my brother and I liked something, we would see it in the theater as many times as we could, because we also had one of those, especially when we moved away from Buffalo to Maryland after 4th grade. We had one of those theaters that was like, you know, the post-theaters when it was done on its regular run, but it was the cheap theaters. You'd pay, you know, like half or less of the normal ticket price, and it would just stay in that theater as long as people were going to see it. So, like, I mean, I remember seeing Jurassic Park like 6 times there after its initial run, because I wasn't allowed to see it when it first came out, but it was still in theaters, at least in the cheap theaters, for years after, at least a couple years, and stuff like that. Braveheart, you know, those big blockbusters of the time. But anyway, I remember seeing A Far Off Place and loving it, and one reason that we were also interested to see it was because my parents were big fans of the Gods Must Be Crazy movies, which, if you've never seen, are absolutely magical, not US made films about characters like field researchers and poachers and militia terrorists all kind of like coming together in a very farcical but poignant, sometimes slapstick, sometimes overtly violent. You know, things were very different in other markets. I think these were made like in the maybe 70s, early 80s. I don't even know how my parents came across them, but we just loved these movies and we watched them over and over again. They centered around the Bushmen in the Kalahari in Africa, and that's where The Far Off Place was set. So, and it had a Bushman in it, so that was an automatic in and hook for us. And again, I'm probably talking way more about this than I meant to, but it's just that was my first exposure to Reese Witherspoon, so I always liked her. Even though she started doing more and more mature roles after that, I didn't see her in much until later, you know, when I saw her as an adult in her more adult roles. But I do remember when Legally Blonde came out, and I remember specifically rejecting it in my own mind, or my willingness to see it, because I just assumed that it was going to be about a ditzy blonde who, you know, despite everything, somehow manages to fail up in Harvard. That's just from what I remember of the previews at the time, or my own, you know, dumb teenage biases. That's just what I figured what the whole trajectory of the movie was. I thought it was going to be a little bit mean. You know, I thought it was going to be more of a farce, and I don't know, it just didn't seem like something I'd be interested in. I just thought it was more specifically for girls and for lowbrow. Not that I was like into everything highbrow, but I don't know, there was just something that turned me off to it, and it wasn't Reese Witherspoon or anything. It was just the premise I just didn't find to be something that would work for me. So I've heard about it over the years. I've heard it come up, but I haven't heard it like, you know, praised. I haven't really paid much of attention when it has come up. People just use it in lists of, you know, like 90s, early 2000s comedies or something else. Like, well, people said that like She's All That was a classic comedy, and, you know, it's been parodied a million times. I never saw that either early on, and part of our whole like revisiting 90s nostalgia on streaming during and after COVID, that was something that we watched, and it definitely gave more context to the parody stuff in like Not Another Teen Movie, which I absolutely love. One of my favorite parody movies ever. But that movie was horrible, and it was bad on like every level to me. I don't know why it was so classic. So I just figured like if something like that could be looked at so fondly but be so bad, I just assumed that that's the same for something like Legally Blonde. So when my wife insisted, she's like, it's one of my favorite movies, you gotta watch this. And we did. And I was blown away by the script, especially. It was so clever and so well written. It just reminded me of like a completely different kind of filmmaking, where somebody actually like had a story to tell. They had a well fleshed out, well-rounded character, to tell that story through, and they did the best job they could. It just didn't feel like there was a lot of interference or, you know, trying to connect it to something else. It was like a great standalone movie and story and character. It was so nice, and yeah, it had like despicable people in it, but it had so much optimism, and that was, you know, carried and upheld by the main character who, you know, even in her lowest moments, she wasn't totally cynical and pessimistic, and, you know, it just took a little push for her to get back on board and, you know, put faith in other people too. It wasn't all about, you know, her like girl bossing it and trampling everybody else, you know, to get to the front, because that's the only way, you know, is to fight. She worked with other people and her legal team, but also, you know, her own ingenuity and cleverness and attention to detail and playing to her strengths. I just thought it was an absolutely delightful, entertaining, positive experience. One of those immaculate scripts that just, like, from beginning to end, they knew what they were doing and they executed it perfectly, even with a couple weird moments like the bend and snap dance scene. It's kind of out of nowhere, but I don't know, it just fit the tone just fine. It didn't detract from it, and some of those characters were goofy enough to make that work. But I also thought the script was smart enough too to kind of like the way that I feel about something like Ace Ventura, where, I mean, that movie's way more of a farce, but it has a grounded story to carry the whole thing that works on its own. Like, if you had said or tried to pitch it without Jim Carrey and without the comedy and just said this is a kidnap mystery, you know, where this like unique idiosyncratic detective has to investigate the you know, slimy underworld or underbelly of the sports complex, industry complex, whatever, you know, to rescue this poor helpless creature. It works on that level. It's absolutely a good story on its own, and then you add all the comedy on top of it, and it elevates it, you know, to even of a more unique experience. But it's still a compelling story. It's not a complete nonsensical farce like a Family Guy episode where nothing really matters and the characters learn nothing and it doesn't lead to anything, and that it's all just about like bits and jokes and references. And that's another thing too about more modern comedies, and I've already done a big episode about this earlier on this podcast called Where's the Funny? If you'd like to go check that out. I don't want to get too much into the specific comedy genre gripes, but the whole idea of, like, you know, getting these like good improv people that are very talented, but to not have like a script, and or at least just have like an outline and just have these people riff for hours and hours and then cut together the best you can. It has that same kind of effect to me of like, just, it's lazy. It's a lazy way to tell a story because you don't have a story. You just have characters and you have sort of, you know, some implied conflict, but it's inconsistent and, you know, it's so obvious and draws attention to itself. Sorry, it's raining. If there's any extra noise or wiper blade squeaking, I apologize. But Legally Blonde felt like they knew exactly what they were doing. They had a vision and they had a really good script and they trusted in that and they made it as well as they could. And I think it's kind of timeless, even though it is very dated in a lot of ways with like the technology and the fashion. It doesn't matter. It's still entertaining. I think it will continue to be, you know, for indefinite years to come. Unlike a lot of super dated and much more product of their time kind of movies, like anything that Judd Apatow has done since like 40-Year-Old Virgin and all these gross out comedies and stuff like that. So after Legally Blonde, we got on a bit of a Sandra Bullock kick, and I love Sandra Bullock. I've always loved her. I think the first thing I saw her in was either Speed or Demolition Man, and she has just always been like the most delightful, relatable, but also like tough and funny actresses, and she continues to be. I wish she was in more stuff, but I get it. You know, she's had her time in the limelight, and she's at that point in her career where she's able to be more picky and choosy about her projects. I've never disliked her in anything. Sometimes I felt like she was maybe a little miscast, but I've never disliked her in anything. But there was, you know, I saw her more of like an action star or hero person, supporting character, whatever it was, because of those things that I saw her in first, and I didn't, for whatever reason, go out of my way to see her in some of her more straight-up comedy or rom-com kind of roles. So the next thing we watched that really stood out to me from that 90s optimistic era was a movie that I vaguely remember hearing about, but I really had no context for at all, so I went in totally blind and cold. It was called While You Were Sleeping, and by the time the movie was over, I looked at my wife and said, I just watched that rare perfect movie, because there was nothing about it that I would change. And I've said that about a few movies over the years, like The Incredibles, for instance, and Master and Commander. Not to say that it's perfect in that it doesn't have any flaws or couldn't use any tweaks, or couldn't, if it was made now, would be made better in some way, who knows. But by perfect, I mean it's a movie where I was just completely immersed and I was never taken out of it, and I wouldn't change a thing. There was something about it that was all so cohesive in such a comforting way. It was such a sweet movie. And it's funny, after all these years, and I'm sure there were many, many, many examples of it before that movie came out, of that tired trope of a misunderstanding where all it takes is like an honest conversation for the conflict to be resolved. It doesn't take a whole movie, and we've seen that so many times since. And like I said, I'm sure that this movie wasn't the first one to do it. So you think I'd be jaded on that now, because I am, like when I see that in modern stuff, and I'm like, oh my god, all they need to do is just talk. Like Batman versus Superman, for instance, BVS, whatever, was one of the more modern, like, worst examples of that. It was so frustrating because the stakes were so big. It was so contrived and unnecessary and lazy to have that climax go down the way that it did. But we'll talk about David S. Goyer some other time. For now, in this movie, it still, was a trope. It was a cliche that she was just kind of in the wrong or the right place at the right time, or the wrong time, or however you want to look at it. And the whole amnesia trope too is, been done so many times. But within the context of this movie, it was all done with such grace, and in the end it really wasn't about the plot and how it all played out. It was really about, the plot was more of just a device to get these characters together, and with the characters in this unique situation, created a canvas for them to, develop their relationships off of, and not just the romantic one between Paulman and Sandra Bullock, but I thought even more kind of profound and heartwarming was what she had with her family. And it's funny, looking at it now, this movie had so many tropes in it and so many cliches that I oftentimes would turn me off or take me out of these experiences. But for somehow this movie made it all work, and it made it work immaculately, ideally. It was delicious. It was a delicious script. Just want to eat it up. Because at the end of the movie, or at least the low point, she has her, when everything kind of comes to a head and her lying and secrecy is now out in the open, she has this whole monologue. Those kind of climaxes where a character just stands up and talks to everybody, and everybody just stands there and listens to them, and it just, I don't know, it's just been done so much, and usually it's not handled very well. To me, that was the weakest part of Mean Girls, when all the characters have to confront each other, and then they just all start talking about their problems and stuff. I know it worked within the movie itself, but to me it felt like the movie kind of screeched to a halt, like it had this kind of flow to it, and then it just stop. There was a movie called Saved that I saw in the theater back when I was in film school in Philly, and we didn't have multiplexes downtown. We just had more indie theaters, and the Mandy Moore, Jenna Malone movie at the Christian school where she's pregnant. It just had a big dialogue climax, and that always felt like the weakest part of the movie. I love the movie, and it's grown on me over the years, how well that climax is written, but I just feel like actions do speak louder than words. So a lot of times those scenes just don't work for me as well as, and this is just probably my own personal preference too, but when somebody's rushing to the airport to get them before they move to France forever and say how they really feel, I find that to be a little bit more cinematically climactic than just characters sitting down and having a conversation, because the conversation, to happen more realistically, should have happened earlier in the story, right? Where like they actually just sat down and told everybody how they feel and told everybody what was really going on, and conflict could have been resolved much earlier and more naturally in that way. So to save it all for the end and then just have everybody sit there and listen, this always felt a little unnatural to me. But for some reason in this movie, because it was so heartfelt and it was so earned, because you got to see not just Sandra Bullock and Bill Pullman, is that right? Am I got the right name there? The guy from Spaceballs and Independence Day. Their relationship was developed so well, but they gave enough time for her to develop a relationship with the rest of the family too, that when she tells them about how close she feels to them and how much she appreciates them and how heartbreaking it is that she's having to, admit her lies, it was really impactful and it really worked for me. I thought it was, as these small scale kind of family comedy dramedy movies go, it was pretty profound, and it was one of the more successful versions of all of these tropes, the amnesia and the coincidental meeting of what you think is your soulmate, and lying about yourself or your situation to perpetuate some situation as long as you can, always knowing that other shoe's going to drop, having a big dialogue climax. I just thought the movie was absolutely positively delightful, and it didn't go off into the realm of I think if it was made today, it would have a lot lower of a low point, and it would be really hard to come back from that. But it was all very believable within context of this story. And another Sandra Bullock movie that I didn't feel was as mwah, chef kiss perfect kind of movie, but still really, really good and much better than I thought it was going to be, was Miss Congeniality. So this was another one too. When it first came out, I remember seeing the trailers, and it just looked really silly. It looked really obvious and predictable, and it just, it looked very kind of plot and situation driven, and I just kind of figured that they'd be kind of riffing on the same basic setup for the joke that she's this tough girl, no nonsense, cop that's going undercover in a prissy, put together, well-to-do beauty pageant, and oh no, what shenanigans are going to unfold. And it does have that, that's definitely part of it. But what I didn't give it credit for, or at least didn't try to see if it was, going to subvert those surface expectations, I didn't give it the chance at the time, was that it actually, like these other movies, all the movies on this list, it really did focus on the characters, and it developed the characters. Not everybody was just a one-note throwaway gag, or a person with just a one personality trait just so they could be involved in some of the situational humor, but not actually have anything to do with the overall story or plot or themes or anything. Everybody that was in there was intentional, and they had a part to play. But it was really a sweet movie, even though, there was the cattiness and there was the superficiality was part of it, but it was very empowering, but not in a mean-spirited or we're seeing a lot now, the girl boss kind of way, where it's a rejection of femininity or, feminine values, and they establish off the bat too that all the dopey guys and the whole male gaze thing, that's nothing new either, but they didn't go out of their way to hit you over the head with the fact that men can be pigs. That was just sort of a given, and they weren't mean-spirited about it. I thought they were just kind of more realistic about it, and it, I didn't take offense as a man or feel it was unfair or unwarranted when they did focus on that. But it was not the thrust of the story. The story was really about these girls finding common ground and banding together, and even though they were in a competitive format, that wasn't the most important thing, and it could have gone that way. It could have, watching it, I was man, I don't know how they're going to get around all of the elephants in the room about the selfishness and the facade of all of this. And at no point was it ever a mean-spirited criticism of pageantry. It had people in it that weren't good for it, that were toxic, that weren't on the level, but it was never meant to be a slap in the face or a rejection of any of these things. It simultaneously kind of lightheartedly joked about this world, but it also upheld it equally. and it showed you the value. It actually made me appreciate the idea of pageantry a little bit more and like what it's really all about, because I've never really experienced it in person. I just have my own biases and preconceived notions about it. And in the end, when Sandra Bullock ends up like kind of in context of the movie, not hugely, but sort of sacrificing what she's after to empower these other girls because she actually really cares about them, was a great character arc for her, and it was just really sweet. And it made me feel good by the end, not just because things worked out plot-wise, but because these characters grew and learned about themselves and each other better, and it just had an optimistic outcome on all fronts without it being silly or unbelievable. The other movie on my list for now is one that I'm really surprised I never saw, but it makes sense, is a movie called Overboard with Kurt Russell and Goldie Hawn. This was a VHS that my parents always had in our little fold-out VHS cabinet, but there were a few movies in there that they would never let my brother and me watch, at least on our own. One of those was When Harry Met Sally. For some reason, I remember a movie called Green Card. I don't know if we were allowed to watch that or not, but I never did. And Overboard was one, and it was probably, because of the mature scenes in it. But that was yet another one. My wife was like, you need to watch this. I think you'd really like it. And yep, she was totally right. And I gotta say, like, while I was watching most of it, kind of like while you were sleeping, I was really unsure if I was going to get past these, cliche storytelling tropes to force conflict where you have, yet again, amnesia, and then you have, somebody lying to another person where that other shoe is going to drop. It's so predictable that it's going to come to a head at some point, but they're going to get whatever they can out of the situation while they can. It had a fish out of water kind of thing going on. It had a lot of those cliches, but darn it, if it wasn't so sweet and so kind-hearted, it just made me smile. And Kurt Russell and Goldie Hawn had such great chemistry. It was so funny. I don't think I've seen Goldie Hawn in enough, because she's kind of predates like my generation of being, a megastar. I've seen her in some stuff, obviously, but a lot of times she plays more of an older character. But seeing her, in this role where she's more supposed to be like a young mother was phenomenal. And her chemistry and the way that she and Kurt Russell played off each other, they were just such naturals. Sometimes I forget how funny Kurt Russell is because he's in so much action, but he is absolutely hilarious. And it's just another one of those situations where they utilized these cliche tropes and predictable storytelling techniques, but they handled them with grace and sincerity, and they never used it in a mean-spirited or super critical way. And just like, while you were sleeping, the real conflict is not about like, oh, how's things going to go down when the truth comes out, because that it's gonna be a very difficult challenge, to say the least, to overcome once you realize you've been lied to for a long time. But the real heart of the conflict is as the characters develop relationships, especially with Kurt Russell and the boys, they create such a natural, organic bond. You just love seeing them together, and you can't imagine them, you put yourself in the shoes of the boys, and they're so happy and also so structured with him. They're getting everything that they need from a father figure, and then he's also getting something that he didn't even know he needed, which was that like love and kinship and family. But these movies, all of them, they never undercut this stuff with cynical jokes. Nobody is so irredeemable or mean or callous or uncaring to the point where you feel like, the emotional coming back together, the payoff at the end is kind of unearned, which is, I feel that a lot in modern comedies and rom-coms especially, but these family dramas too. But this is one too where they do the thing that I really, really value, is after the low point, they go all out with, like, visually having Kurt Russell, take action to reclaim, his, or to really show, to prove and portray, not just say it, but show his love for Goldie Hawn and the family, and do whatever he can and put everything on the line. And it really endeared me to his character, because he really was a jerk for a long time. And, even when he got kind of comfortable and he was being nice to the family, he was still doing a horrible thing by lying to them and lying to Goldie Hawn. So he had to put himself through something significant to, kind of earn his place back into their good graces. So I thought, climactically, when it comes to these kind of movies, this was like the perfect rom-com climax that I like, that I prefer, is when the character that screwed up the most is the one that has to put the most on the line to make it up to the other person. That's just, how it should be. There's one movie that came out in the, was it like late 90s or like really, really early 2000s? Because I think I was still in high school, but only just at the time, where I loved the whole movie, and this isn't a comedy, it's a drama, but, same kind of flow to the story, was Love and Basketball, which I loved the whole movie, but even, as a teen, I really was disappointed and deflated by the ending, where the guy did like a lot of selfish, horrible, mean things to the girl, and then she just kind of was like, yeah, okay, well, I just don't want to not be with you, so I'll just kind of forget about all that. And he doesn't really do anything to redeem himself. He doesn't do anything to earn her trust back or earn her respect back. So, see, and that just kind of proves my point that movies like that have always been around, where writers want it to end a certain way but don't set up or pay it off correctly. They just kind of force it. But these past 4 movies that I talked about really earn all of their comedy, their emotional climaxes, their like live happily ever after kind of feelings at the end, and most of all, they earn their optimism. They earn the smile on my face because they make me feel good, not just that things worked out, but that people can be nice and people can be kind, and even through challenges and, even if they're fictional narrative situations, still, it shows me that the people that wrote them seem to believe that these things can be true. And isn't that what media should be, at least sometimes, is a mirror for us to want to better ourselves, to give us examples of how things could be, how we could treat each other, how we could live and interact and make choices. It's not just about what we've seen, since the early 2000s and all of the unrest that we've had in the world, the nihilism, where stories are over and over about like, hey, isn't humanity messed up and aren't people horrible to each other? And it's like, yeah, I get that, but like, why just indulge in that and not give us any room or any grace to have hope? Because if you don't have hope, what is worth fighting for? I feel like that's a quote-ish from something. I don't know. It sounds like it could be in Harry Potter or something, but I don't know. The last thing I want to point out, though, about all of these movies is that, as far as I know, I could be wrong because I haven't dug into the Wikipedia too deeply, but as far as I know, they were all original, unique spec scripts that weren't based on anything, that weren't adaptations or reboots. I don't know. I mean, maybe some of these, maybe Overboard, was a remake of like a 1943 movie or something. It totally could be. I have no idea. But from as far as I know, and what I really appreciate about these is that they were original, and it just goes to show that, like, if you have the desire and you have a story to tell and you have characters to tell that story, it is possible. I think we're in this era now where we're so far removed from the 90s that there's so much nostalgia for the 90s, from like grunge to pop music, people talking about Britney Spears again for some reason. There's nu metal is popular again, and baggy pants and like Jinkos and skater pants and UFOs. I think it's high time for there to also be a nostalgia resurgence of well-written, well-intentioned, optimistic, lighthearted, fun, comedy, rom-com, dramedies that we used to see in the 90s. Because, geez, right now especially, what the world needs now is hope, and we need to smile and laugh and feel good about each other, feel good about things. Alright, so that is it for me today on this road trip. Hopefully next time I'll actually be in a quiet room, but knowing my life, probably not. So either way, until then, thank you very much, so much for listening. If you have any suggestions of movies of this kind that I didn't talk about or that I haven't seen, or things that you discovered later or things that you discovered back then, or anything in between, you can find me at breathingunderwater.us. And I'll see you soon. Thank you.